Welcome to this Welcome to this briefing on making resource consent notification decisions and managing public interest around development proposals. This is something that we've requested as elected members, as there's a lot of interest in the changes that are happening around the community and council's role and where council's influence begins and ends and the nature of that, the work that we do. So really looking forward to this briefing today, which is being live streamed, and hopefully it will be also a useful resource for people to access. So I'll pass over to staff and I'll let you introduce yourselves and share the briefing with us. Thank you.
Yeah, all right. Good day, everyone. So my name is Eloise Carstens, and I am the Resource Consents and Compliance Manager. And with me today, I've got the support of my trustee Steed to the left. So Sashin Neer is our Resource Consents team leader. Now, I understand that there is at the moment quite a bit of interest in notification and how those decisions are made, and I would like to, in my presentation today, just take you through how those decisions are made and what are the things that we consider when we make it. So before I start, I think it is probably timely to say that the approach to notification has changed quite a bit over the years with the RMA. Prior to 2009, there was a way more or a broader range of things that we could consider to determine notification, and that really changed with the amendment to the RMA in 2009, where they introduced very strict criteria for a notification. And the whole purpose of that was to reduce delays and to introduce a more streamlined process to to notification, right? And the result of that was that obviously we've received a lot less applications.
Recording in progress.
That could be notified. Right. So when we make the notification decisions, it really allows us to consider the potential effect on affected parties or people that would be affected by the proposed application, right? And it is one of two critical processes in the RMA or in the resource consent consideration, right? It is the RMA is a very permissive framework, right? And what it means is that when you look at a resource consent, they want to limit the need to ask for permission to use the land. That means that as a right, you want people to use the land for land use applications or for subdivision, right? But the process. So when it comes to notifying the consent, there really is very limited criteria that we can consider for the resource consent. Okay, so I'll jump into it. Sorry. So who and how do we make the decision of notification? As consent planners, we prepare a notification report, and we first consider whether the application meets the criteria or the thresholds for public notification. These thresholds or criteria are prescribed in the RMA, and it's very prescriptive and limited in terms of what we can consider. The main criteria essentially comes down to what are the adverse effects. So in order for an application to be notified, it needs to be more than minor. And what that means is that the effect of the consent should it be granted, would have more adverse effects on the people that are surrounding it. So it could be a public effect, or it could be neighbors to the application that would be affected by it. And when we make that decision as planners, we have to be very careful how we make it, because any decision that we make could potentially be judicially reviewed. So of course, we have to be clear in how and why we have decided that an application is either notified or not notified. Okay. So when it comes to options for notification, like I said, the first thing that we consider is whether the application has a public interest. If it is seen that there are effects that are that could potentially affect the wider environment or the broader community to a more than minor extent, then the application would be publicly notified. Now, there are three instances where public notification would be done. The first is if the applicant requests it to be publicly notified, or if the adverse effects on the environment will be more than minor. And I will try to explain with more than minor. Again, the criteria for that is extremely prescriptive in the RMA. So it has to meet specific criteria for it to be considered more than minor. So when we receive an application, we would be looking at getting advice from experts in the field. So, for example, if it is a consent where there are potentially effects that could affect transport routes, or it could be something where natural hazards, yeah, that's a good example. If those effects are there and there's a risk of it being more than minor, we would get the experts in to provide us with that advice. They then consider, is it something that can be mitigated to a lesser effect? And if it cannot be mitigated, then potentially it would be publicly notified. A third criteria that really affects public notification is if it is required by the district plan or the regional plan. Sometimes under the NES there are specific criteria as well that would justify public notifications. So how the process works under bullet 2 there is that we really would make an opportunity for the public to make a submission. We then present our application or the application at a hearing, and members from the public would then be able to submit on the application, and as planners, we would consider that when we make the decision on whether the consent could be granted. All right. Yep, I can absolutely explain it. So the national environmental standards, if I can come back to that, there are standards under the RMA that are prescribed for specific things like highly productive land is one of them. That's right, the soil criteria. And what that means is that these standards are set for what criteria we would consider. If it exceeds those standards, then we might need to publicly notify it as well. So in every resource consent application that we get, we have to consider in the first instance if there are any national standards.
Part 2 matters.
Yes, correct. So we consider that as part 2 under the RMA to see whether those standards would be affected by the proposed application. Another example would be with communication.
Indigenous biodiversity, MPSUB.
Yes. So yeah, there are specific standards that we consider for every resource consent. All right, and then sorry, I just have to see if it is limited as well. So for limited notification, the criteria again is in terms of whether it's more than minor, right? It is usually when the application is likely to affect a specific group of people. In most instances, it would be an application where what they are proposing are likely to affect a directly neighboring property, or it could be local iwi, or someone else that potentially use the land for something, and this application or proposal is likely to affect how they can use that land. So in those instances, we would give an opportunity for um, again, they are identified through the resource consent process. So our internal process at the moment is that we would get the planners together. The processing planner would consider or present the application to the team, and they would raise what potential effects have come out of the consenting process that could be considered more than minor. And then the planners at the moment, the process is to really scrutinize the decision making to ensure that we have a robust approach to notification. And again, all of that is recorded and written down in a notification report. The reason why we have to do that is, again, like I said, that any decision that we make needs to be legally robust, which means that it can be challenged, and the planner would need to be able to stand up and defend the decision that they've made. Something else that is really important to understand is that just because someone has an interest in an application doesn't mean that we automatically consider them an affected party. And I will put my neck out and try to make a joke of this, right? When I was a student, I did my master's degree. We had a particularly delightful professor that was presenting on the difference between affected and interested parties. And he used to say that if you think of breakfast table, right? You've got your bacon and your eggs on the table. Now, if you look at that, the chicken is the interested party, but the pig would be the affected party. So I don't know if that is a good way of looking at it. Yeah.
We need a picture of that on our website.
All right. So like I said in the beginning, when we look at the notification decision as a whole, the intention of the RMA is really for people of the land to be able to use it without asking permission to use it, right? And very often in district plans and in national standards, you would find that there are requirements about what shouldn't be notified, right? In Plan Change 2, we introduced 32 rules that precluded notification. What that means is that those any criteria that would be triggered during a consent application for those sites would preclude notification, so we cannot notify in any case. And in most instances, all applications would not trigger a more than minor effect. And therefore, we cannot consider that they would be adversely affected persons. And I would say the bulk of our consent then goes through as non-notified applications, as is the intention with the RMA at the moment.
Are we able to ask questions now, or is it at the end?
No,
That's
no,
great.
I think we'll get through the presentation
okay.
just because it's,
Okay.
yeah. Thanks.
So the RMA does make mention of special circumstances. Now, what does that essentially mean? It means that the RMA does provide council discretion to publicly notify a resource consent application if that would normally have been non-notified. Okay, those criteria is really set for situations that are unusual, exceptional, or outside of the norm. So we wouldn't normally go down that track. And there's a lot of case law that actually prescribes how these decisions are made. Special circumstances are essentially meant to be exceptional, not the rule. And the reason for that is so that it kind of prevents councils to overuse the provisions and to ensure that the non-notification process is still the norm for decision making. It is also important to note at this stage that courts have provided some guidance documents that very often influence or helps to guide us on what would constitute a special circumstance, and not I guess it's not really just based on high public interest that would make it a special circumstance. So we would need to be able to justify why we would consider something a special circumstance, and again, we would need to put those recommendations down in a report, then that again would be open for public scrutiny. So we've provided some statistics here in terms of the MFE data that we've got online. So you can have a look there. There's about 40,000 resource consents that were processed in New Zealand for the 2022-23 financial year. For that year, KCDC had 187 resource consents, and the proportion, if you look at the national statistics, is less than 5% that actually gets notified, and for KCDC that is even less than 1% at the moment, right? The reason for that is because the fast track application process has been introduced, and a lot of the complex applications that would normally constitute public notification has actually been taken out of the system, and we now no longer need to publicly notify it. Non-notified applications then essentially makes up, like I said earlier, about 90% of all consents. And if you look at the statistics in terms of granting consents, 99% of consents are granted. So there's very, very few chances really where we would decline an application. So what is the reason for that? It is simply because the threshold for notification is very high, and we cannot, under the RMA and the legislative framework that is available for notification, there's not a lot of scope for us to consider things for notification. So, we understand that very often elected members will be approached by members of the public about notification, and people will see themselves as being affected by an application. And while we certainly understand that that is the case, that your view may be affected, or your distance, your sunlight may be affected, and there will be more traffic on the roads, or it's not that we are not unsympathetic to that. We absolutely are. It is just that it doesn't meet the criteria for notification. So in order for us to, yeah, and I guess from our perspective, we get criticized quite a bit, um, and we need to be make robust decisions, like I said earlier as well. So we need your help from a consenting point of view to make sure that the public understands where that line is and what we can consider for notification. Um, there is an opportunity for us to clarify what those lines are, and we can build on different relationships to make sure that we are clear in our communication when we deal with the public. So elected members play a key role in maintaining the community's trust in the resource consenting process, and if no non-notified consents lead to dissatisfaction, it the only opportunity really is to push policy discussions harder and make sure that we make the necessary adjustments in our district plan to allow for that. So, notification really requires a high level of technical expertise and judgment. And we, as planning staff, have to consider and weigh a lot of things up when we make those decisions. The first is environmental effects. So that can involve consulting with experts such as ecologists, engineers, noise experts, geohydrologists, hydrologists, and we do that in order to understand the potential impacts of the proposal, and it also helps us to strengthen a case for notification. So, if our expert witnesses provide sufficient or significant information that can help us make that decision, those are the things that that certainly help us to clarify and justify why notification is needed. It is about balancing development with community interests as well. So while developers may want their applications processed really quickly with minimal public involvement, as council we must balance this with the rights of the community to be heard, particularly where their interests may be adversely affected. So again, this is the case of it being more than minor and it ticking that box. There's also public perception, and even if an activity's effects are deemed minor, the public perception can play a significant role in how an application is perceived. High-profile projects or developments in sensitive areas, for example, are more likely to warrant notification due to the public interest in the outcome. So planning staff must apply the thresholds really rigorously and document our decision-making process very clearly because again, it needs to be justifiable. So in terms of how elected members can help us, it helps when reference is referred back to the planning team or the appropriate department to explain where in the process we are and what factors we are considering in our decision making. You can see there on the right hand side is some words that we can get out to help elected members direct specific application or requests in the right direction, and those are the type of things that would really help us to, justify and deal with the process appropriately. It's also important to really just explain that there are thresholds that need to be considered. So, and then finally, we understand that the decision about notification can be a frustrating process, but it is important that when you come into a situation where you have to ask why isn't it notified or not notified, the question is what process, policy and procedure has already been involved, where are we in the decision-making process, and again, what opportunity is there to change the ground rules, whether there's any policy decisions that could actually make the decision-making process easier. So that's it from my side. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you for that. That's a wealth of information, distilled very nicely into a very concise presentation. So we'll have some questions now. Councillor Pravanov?
Thank you very much for that presentation, Eloise. I've got a number of questions. So my first one relates to slide 4. So it says adversely affects the wider environment, including the broader community, to more than minor. So I suppose in there's a number of things that probably need clarification in terms of what part does the environment play in terms of these more than minor things? What part does the community, i.e. there's a high-rise building going next to my property, that's me personally, and then I suppose the question is, how do you define more than minor? Just in that one, there's three things in that.
Okay, I'll leave the difficult question about more than minor for Sashin to answer. In terms of the wider environment, I would say that it really depends on the effects that come into play for the specific application, right? So if I could use an example, for public notification, the Go Media billboard, I don't know if you remember, it's the one down Kapiti Road. That was a publicly notified application that council processed probably about 5 years ago. And so the wider environment in that instance, we considered all the users of Kapiti Road to be affected by the billboard. And if I remember correctly, if memory serves me correctly, it was about the safety effect on that road. So we considered that because there were X number of vehicles driving on that road every day, and initially, if I remember correctly, it was meant to view the other way around, which would have increased the safety risk on that road. We then, through mitigation and negotiation with the application, turned it so that it viewed towards Kapiti Island, which created a backdrop that lowered the visual effect of the billboard. But still, the movement of images, all of that, we considered would be an effect that had a potential safety risk along the road. So in that specific example, the wider environment included the road users. It wasn't just, maybe the shop owners close to the billboard that would have been affected. It would have been everyone that uses the road. So and we also found through quite a rigorous process of safety assessments that was done on that piece of road, that the effect would have been more than minor. And that then justified it for us to become a public notification. So, what was your second question?
The specific effects on individuals, I can't remember the exact words in
Broader
there.
community?
More than minor. I think I'll take it from there.
So what this is saying potentially is that if you're a house, if you live right next door to something, that can't be taken into consideration as a more than minor effect, or it can be.
Yeah, if I can answer that question. So, how do planners get to more than minor is a discussion that I have with a lot of people on a weekly basis. So, when we talk about wider community effects, first of all, in terms of like public notification, we kind of look what the plan says and effects on the wider environment. So, things like ecology, landscape and visual for really dense, really high developments that don't meet that permitted standards, that kind of change character and amenity of an existing environment that affects the wider community. And we've had instances where we have larger subdivision type developments that were kind of possibly triggering those effects, and which resulted in discussions with developers, and they omit that stage or plan to move it on another consideration. They tweak their applications, which is why then, we kind of get a lot of flack because sometimes what's communicated sometimes by developers is that we're taking a bit long in our processing of applications, but it's actually us working with the community as well as developers to get those effects to a more manageable level. High-rise buildings, effects that trigger more than minor is potentially cultural effects, heritage values in certain areas, areas that have significant overlays in terms of outstanding areas, in terms of their landscape, flood hazards, effect on the community by not managing stormwater and displacement effects of development without proper modeling. And something that's become really common now is water demand management and not providing water tanks, which is a very interesting discussion because, a few developments are proposing not to provide that. So it's kind of what we assess when we go through our planning arguments, as well as the implication on council infrastructure long term going ahead, not providing for these requirements in the plan. So those are some of the considerations the planners make with regards to the plan requirements, what can be achieved with LDMR, and the wider stroke long-term effects that it can have, not just on the community, but council's planning, financial planning, especially on our infrastructure, by not providing services and infrastructure required by the plan. Regarding dense developments next to people who kind of get blindsided, it's kind of becoming the norm, especially post PC2. Our plans really enabling in terms of subdivisions where we no longer have permitted allotment sizes. Unfortunately, those criteria were set to us by national government. It's come down, it's formed what our PC2 looks like. It's not something where council had a lot, to do. We were kind of guided to do that, which has resulted in a lot more denser applications becoming quite permitted under the plan. So regarding that, we kind of, especially in the residential zones, have a permitted baseline for development, which we consider when we make our effects. And a lot of these developments can get quite dense in the residential areas, We have a height standard that's now 11 meters. People, as of right, can build 3 dwellings on their property as of right. The setbacks have reduced to 1 meter. So it kind of introduces a perceived threat to people suddenly when they're confronted with dwellings that can go up on adjacent properties that can get to 1 meter away from the boundary, up to 11 meters high. And yeah, it's kind of embedded in our plan that we have currently. So, you know, we even outlook spaces, it's quite, you know, we have a set criteria of 20 squares in the plan. So a lot of these developments are meeting their height standards, their density standards, their outlook spaces. So it's ticking all of the boxes in terms of our permitted baseline in the residential areas. So we have to consent it, unfortunately. So,
Right,
well,
okay.
I don't want to say unfortunately, but under the plan we do.
Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I did, thank you, and it actually answered a couple of others I had. So in terms of plan change 2, you said there were these 32 rules. So they were actually ones that we had to agree to, is that correct? But based on,
Yeah,
yes,
that's correct.
okay, that's good. Okay, so the notification report that's written, is that a publicly notified, is that a public document?
So if the decision to make a notification is if we decide to notify it in whatever form, if it's public or limited notification, yes, that is we usually upload that onto the website. The notification decision, if it's a non-notified application, that decision is included in our resource consent report. So it would still need to justify why it didn't meet the criteria for notification.
Right, so that means that if it wasn't notified in any form, people have to wait until the very end to see the
The
reasons
resource
for it.
consent, yeah, that's
Okay.
correct.
Okay, oh yes, so my last question, thank you everyone for your patience. So you gave the, all the figures about the notifications on page 7. So this was actually 22, 23. What has it been since we implemented plan change 2? I would imagine that would actually drop. Would that be a fair assessment?
Correct. I don't have the exact figures on hand, but I'm happy to provide that. What we have found so to give you a practical example, in the last financial year, we have only had two limited notifications. There was no public notifications made last year. Only 2 were notified. And although it went through the notification process, the decision wasn't issued because the applicant withdrew their application. So it didn't go all the way through to the end of the process. But that gives you some idea of just how limited it really is.
Okay, appreciate that. Thank you.
Great. Good questions, actually. Really good. Councillor Coe?
Thank you. It was an excellent run through. I'm just thinking of it from totally selfishly, from the point of view of an elected member who receives sometimes dozens of emails about a particular development. I guess Otahanga springs to mind. I mean, there's clearly an information gap in the public on these matters. How do we better inform the wider community? It's one thing, you know, having a briefing for us here, but the real issue is that people in our community aren't aware of the background and how things have changed. And, you know, the old quarter acre dream section is long gone. So I guess in terms of responding to these kind of mass email events, it seems to me that we need to be able to respond with a link to some information either on the website or a brochure, a PDF brochure or something like that that sets out everything you've talked about today in real simple plain English, that sets out how it is, and that tells people why elected members are not really in a position to interfere with the process. That it needs to go through that whole regulatory framework. It's not up to us to meddle with that. And I guess what their rights are in terms of how they can challenge any decision in terms of whether something is considered to have minor effects or not.
Yes, absolutely.
So I think, we need to be able to quickly respond, because the last thing we want is for these things to escalate, and people get all, then you have, mass meetings condemning council, and it all gets out of hand because there hasn't been the right information at the start of the process kind of thing. So I think we need to very quickly be able to respond to people, say, here's the situation in general as to what is allowable and what isn't, and what can be done and what your rights are. But then also where we have a sort of a mass situation such as Otahanga, for someone to be able to quickly respond and say, not only is this general information, but specifically with regard to this application, here's what the situation is, and to let people know straight away.
Yeah.
Rather than waiting for, like I know we had a meeting on it just recently, but by the time you organise all of that, there's a whole lot of water under the bridge, and things have kind of got out of hand, and there's unnecessary anxiety in the community, and I think we don't want that. We don't want people being anxious and feeling like things are out of control. We need to give them some reassurance that everything's going according to plan, even though they might not like the plan.
Yeah, I think it's important. So something that I didn't touch on is the fact that the notification decision is really made right at the end of the process. So what the public often don't really understand is that the start of the process probably takes about 80% of the time. That means that in the first instance, when we get the application, we have to consider whether it's sufficient. We have to ask for further information, and then it's a back and forth negotiation with applicants to ensure that we get the information that we need. And it's only when all of that has been satisfied that we are in a position to consider, okay, we've got the information that we asked for, now let's consider whether we need to notify it. So that's only in the last 20% of the process, right? But in terms of having a quick response, I think it is important that from our side, possibly we need to look into ways that we can give up-to-date status updates, essentially, to elected members. What that means is that if it's still on further information, yes, it's in the further information process, notification decision hasn't been made yet. And, just to feed back that information.
That's right.
And then once the decision is made, to quickly respond with that information.
Because I had talked to James about where we realise that something's probably going to be a contentious issue, having some sort of information campaign within the community to say, hey guys, there's this development coming up which is going to happen. We're just letting you know that it's going to happen, but unfortunately you don't have a say in it unless blah, 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 but just to sort of alert people.
Yeah,
advance.
That's a sticky one, because you're kind of straying into the area of notification. Yeah. I'll just ask the chief executive to comment on that, maybe.
I hear what you're saying, but I'm just going to flip it on you. So you're doing something on a piece of land that is zoned for what you want to do, and you are dealing with the council, and you see on the council's website that we've updated the entire community about what you're doing.
Yep.
When they have no right to that information.
Okay. All right.
That's something
Fair
between
enough.
you and
that's a good
the
point.
council.
Yeah, I can see that.
So the emphasis that normally is on the developer to engage with neighbours, communities.
Right.
If they think there's something contentious, if you've got a really good consultant planner, you won't get a lot of that sort of noise.
Right.
What I'm seeing in the time that I've been here is that we are growing, and we are growing at a clip. We've introduced the new medium density rules because we are a tier 1 region, and with that comes a heap of challenges for a community that was small to medium that is now seen as the region's growth node. Right, so Wellington is no longer the desirable place to live. It's out towards Wairarapa, it's north towards Kapiti and Horowhenua. And if you look at the FDS, that's actually what it talks about is Kapiti growing to 85,000 people in the next sort of 15 to 20 years. So that will bring a lot of challenge for us.
Yeah.
So as the regulator, I think it's really important to understand how much we are allowed to put in the public sphere, and how much the developer who may want to smooth the waters is also prepared to engage with those people. And as I was listening to your question, I pulled up our website. So there's a link that we can provide to the community, and again, it's about the consenting process. So what do you need if you're looking for a resource consent? What do you need if you're looking for a building consent? It's not, I don't think, and Steve will correct me here if I'm wrong, it won't be a one page, because the process is so detailed and it's so legislatively required. It's really hard to simplify down what it is that you do need to do without trying to, I guess, oversimplify the process.
But it kind of needs to be from the perspective not of the person applying for a consent, but from a member of the community who's unhappy with something that they've come to
Well, they just go off to the complaints department, because, that's... You don't have a right to complain about what someone is doing if they're entitled to do it. We need to deal with that post. So that's through a service request, for argument's sake.
So as elected members, we just need something we can respond back with to say, here's what you can do. You're kind of wasting your time in effect coming to elected members, because...
So maybe some quick FAQs, right? Would be helpful.
It would be really good, and we can just...
James has
out.
already offered to circulate some of those, so they should be coming really shortly.
Nice.
But these are really good suggestions and points for discussion, because it's exactly why we're here today, to work out how far can we go, what can we do, how can we facilitate this, and what is actually quite a tightly controlled legislative environment.
But I think at the end of the day, it's all about, taking away that anxiety and angst in the community, which is unnecessary, because there's no point getting anxious and angry about stuff that you can't control.
There's maybe 2 points that I just wanted to raise as well. So in terms of limited notifications, right, there is our standard approach is that if we come across a site that could potentially affect a neighbour, we would ask the applicant to consider approaching that neighbour and having that discussion, right? And if they didn't do that, before we make the notification decision, we would ask for written approval. So that is the opportunity for the applicant then to go and speak to that neighbour and ask for their approval. If they don't want to provide it, so if the affected neighbour do not want to provide the written approval, they don't agree with the development, and they essentially refuse the written approval, then it becomes a limited notification process automatically. So that means that then we have to have discussions with that neighbour and the developer to see how we can come to a common understanding. The second thing that I wanted to mention was in terms of the judicial review process, right? So once a decision is made to not notify an application and the decision is granted, anyone from the public essentially can go into a process where they ask for that decision to be reviewed by the court system. And I think it is something that potentially, while it could be daunting for us as planners, it strengthens the process because it ensures that we do
There's a check
consider
in the
the right
system. Yeah.
things when we make
right.
those decisions, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Those are the 2 points that I just wanted to
Yeah.
make.
So all that needs to go in that FAQ, doesn't
Yeah,
it?
yeah.
Great. Okay, thank you.
Sophie? Yeah, because Jocelyn's already had a few questions, and then we'll go to you next, Jocelyn.
Yeah, cool. Thank you so much. I agree with Liz. I think that was a really useful rundown. So thank you for putting it together. I'm just keen to get a sense of whether there's more risk or kind of what the relative risk is and the potential negative consequences for council in terms of being open for judicial review or what have you, or some sort of scrutiny. If we notify consent that does not need to be notified versus not notifying one that does, like those two, is one of them a more risky situation for council than the other, if that makes sense? Or are we open to the same potential consequences?
It's an interesting question. I have to say that I've never heard the other side. It's usually people that wanted to be notified that don't get notified. But I guess if it's a notification decision that the applicant don't agree with, then they can appeal the decision. And again, it would be the same level of risk. I don't see that it would be any different between the two. It's just a process that we have to go through, and it just shows you how important it is that the planners make robust decisions, and that we can justify our decisions for notification or deciding not to notify.
I'll actually go to Martin. Sorry, Jocelyn, before I forget.
Sorry, just getting my headphones off. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yep, fabulous. Yeah, just got some questions here, and I'm sorry if I'm not poking sticks. I think this has been absolutely amazingly informative, and I really, really appreciate it. I do take on Liz's point about having a go-to space that can answer those basic questions, even pointing out the fact that PC2 has limited the ability in the space, but it sounds like that's already in train, which is good. So it'd be good to know that as well. Just a couple of things I just wanted to get some thoughts on. When you're talking about getting written approval, I'm aware of in the past, and this might be perhaps a little bit more applicable to pre-PC2, that there have been some requirements. It became a requirement to get approval from all the neighbours, if you like, when there was and it wasn't even necessarily big projects, so some I would call lower end projects as well. Is that sort of a situation, or is it something that's more nudged towards it would be advantageous to get the permissions rather than it actually being a requirement?
Yes, so I would probably say that it is more to their advantage. And it comes down to this discussion, just talking to your neighbor and actually letting them know what it is that you are proposing. But yeah, there's no specific requirement that I'm aware of under the district plan that requires.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
If I can add to that, it's always advantageous to get written approval if you can for your development.
Yeah.
If you have written approval from neighbor or neighbors, then under the planning framework, planners would disregard the effects on that neighbor or those neighbors, which then alleviates your assessment of effects quite considerably. So yeah, if those neighbors sign off on your proposed development, then council or the planning team would disregard potential effects on that neighbor. neighbors.
So I guess that potentially opens you up to the good old NIMBYism side of things, where just because that's in fact some neighbours might just not like it, regardless of whether it's allowed or not. And if that you couldn't get the permissions, would that trigger that limited requirement for a limited hearing? And if so, who would pay for that? Would it be up to you as the person putting the application in?
Yeah, so limited notifications are paid by the applicant, and yes, you're right. So if we required written approval as part of the process and it wasn't received, or the applicant didn't get it, or they refused to get it, all of that would trigger a notification immediately. It becomes a limited notified application.
I guess that falls back to my first question: is that then does that become just a fallback position to get permissions? And if you can't get permissions, you're going to have to pay for a hearing as such.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And that's something that we definitely, when we start our conversations with applicants, that's normally what we would go through as part of the process. In any case, we would just say to them, well, have you spoken to your neighbor? Are they aware? That open and honest conversations before actually going through the process.
I guess the trip up to that would be that if the what you're doing is a activity does fit into the district plan and doesn't require permission as such, then there's really no need for a hearing. Would that be right?
Yes, that's correct. So activities that are precluded under the RMA or the district plan, they don't need written approval.
Okay, look, thank you for that. Our next question is around limited notifications, and that's that interest versus does not translate to affected. I love the comparison you made, by the way. I'm just using the example as 240 Kapiti Road. I'm not really litigating anything, but that was a fairly robust process with regards to notification. The people that were I guess interested, thought they were affected, but they were more interested parties, went down the judicial review side of things. And that really is that sort of a mechanism, shall we say, that can be used for, shall we say, those that can afford it, to really slow the process down and make it a bit harder for the developer? Is there any way to combat that? I'm picking that there's more than likely not.
Well, yes. I mean, if you think of it from that perspective, that's exactly why the RMA changed in 2009. Is to try and speed up the process so that you do not have these long delays at the start of the consenting process. But yes, you're right that that could definitely affect the development to the point that the developers often do not proceed.
That's exactly what
Simply
happened.
because it becomes too onerous.
Can I?
Yeah.
Sorry, Councillor. Yeah, if I can add to that, so development would cease. It would put a hold on most applications in train on the BC side as well, potentially because the outcome of a judicial review process can result in the decision being set aside, potentially, and then the applicant would have to relodge a new resource consent if they do decide to proceed ahead. So that's where, we go through that really robust process when we do our notification and our assessments for planning applications, purely because the result of a judicial review can not be for council if decisions are set aside by the court.
Yeah, I hear you. Is there any leeway, if people are sort of taking a malicious approach to that sort of situation? I guess I'm picking again, there's not.
Sorry, can you just repeat the question?
I mean, if people are prepared to pay the bill for a judicial review if they lose, there's not much you can do about it.
Yeah, that's right. So if you go through the process and that is the outcome of the Environment Court, then you do have other opportunities. You could take it to the High Court, if I'm correct. You can take it higher. But essentially, it's your appetite and obviously the depth of your pockets, how far you want to take it.
Yeah. I have two more questions. Next one, you talked to 100% of applications being granted. Is this due to the application requirement or request by council to achieve consent, like the conditions on there? If we take a conservative approach to that situation, there can be quite a lot of conditions, shall we say, which need to be fulfilled. Is there leeway to be going a little bit overboard in that space?
Yes, so there's two things to consider here. The first thing is that as part of our Section 88 process, now I'm talking RMA terms here, right? But that's essentially the very first part of the consenting process where we consider whether the information that we have is sufficient for us to consider the application. So again, the RMA is very prescriptive in terms of those criteria and what needs to be provided as part of your application, right? So as part of the Section 88 process, we could reject an application, which means that if there isn't sufficient information for us to consider it, then we reject it. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is that even though there isn't necessarily a decision to decline an application, we quite regularly reject an application at the start of the process due to insufficient information. So that's the first instance. The second instance is that when we make the decision ultimately to grant a consent, yes, there are a lot of conditions on it, but what you would try to do is to alleviate, to negotiate the decision-making process in the further information stage. So that means that you kind of negotiate what you want to receive during that stage of the process. So by the time you get to conditions, you essentially just want to have the really big items that needs to be conditioned, if you may.
Yeah, no, I hear what you're saying. And that Section 88's been a relatively recent addition, isn't it? Because it used to be the Section 32s that we used, but we've sort of stepped that process up by introducing Section 88s being used a bit more as a tool in this space. Is that right?
Yeah, we do use Section 88 as part of our initial assessment of an application. If an application is complete and the planners have sufficient information to move the application forward in terms of the assessment of the application. So 88 is our first checks on application completeness.
Okay.
And then there's a Section 32, is that right?
Yep.
Which comes.
So we don't really use Section 32
No.
anymore. I think it might be under
initial assessment.
No.
Oh, might be the wrong thing, sorry.
92 would be
Yeah.
further information.
Okay. And just my last one, this might actually be more of a question to the CEO. We've got situations, say, we brought this up before, where we've got economic development trying to empower hospitality and other things. And we had that situation in the town centre, in the business area down to Roto Drive, where liquor outlets, here we are on one hand encouraging distillers or brewers into an area, but on the other hand, the district plan doesn't allow for retail sales as such. What's the process of updating the district plan to perhaps be more allowing of the type of things we're trying to establish from the economic development perspective? Is there a process we need to be looking at that, or is there one currently being looked at the moment?
Yes, correct. That's more a policy question. But yeah, that would be through a plan change. I think if there's any areas where you want to reconsider what is allowed within a specific zone, that would have to go through a plan change process.
I'm sorry, I can't see who's in the room, but do we know, is there anything like that in the pipeline at the moment? Because I know this was an issue, say, for granting the licensing around one of the issues around Tuatara Breweries, around the Bond Store, and these sorts of things. Here we are trying to encourage something, but I know a plan change can be a time-consuming process as such. I was just wondering, does anyone know if anything is in the pipeline at all?
Kia ora. Sorry, Martin. Chris here. I think we've previously discussed the impact and challenge of the example that you've raised. We've got it on our radar to come back and talk to you about priorities for the next lot of district plan changes that come through. And we'd be looking to see if we can wrap that into a package if it does, come to the top of the priorities. But we've obviously already got quite a long list from you, as well as stuff that's already planned. So I think we're wanting to have a conversation with you, which will be coming up in the diary November, December, essentially.
Okay, no, that's good. Just a curiosity. Thanks for the answer there, Chris. That's it for me. Thank you very much, and thank you for an excellent presentation.
Cool. Bede, I guess, is next.
Yes, okay, cool. Just a couple of questions. So you've mentioned judicial reviews, and I guess they're sort of always in the front of your mind in terms of where things might go and where the boundaries are. How often are judicial reviews happening? And like, if you look across the last couple of years, how many have we had?
One. Do we know of one?
I think 240 Captain Road was our most recent one. We do have quite a good record with the outcomes of our judicial reviews, so we have been making good decisions.
Yeah. So to answer, that's the one side of things. So if it's a judicial review, it could be from an applicant, from a neighbour or an affected party not agreeing with the process or the outcome of a process, right? But we also get objections to our decisions, which is a different process from the applicant's point of view. So that's where they don't agree with the decision that was made, and it's sort of just a different avenue of getting to the same process. And there's probably two that I know of that has gone down that track. So in total, maybe 3 in the past 5 years.
Okay. So they're not happening frequently?
No, it's not a frequent occurrence. And I think it is probably because, of the cost associated with it, and it has long delays because you have to go through the court system.
Another important thing to mention is that any consent application that council grants or the planners grant can be judicially reviewed. So it's not just limited to the ones that potentially may track into notification. It's from our smallest application.
Yeah.
Any decision that a planner issues can go judicial review.
So it's quite an expensive and daunting process to go through. Yeah. The 100% of applications granted struck me as an odd sort of a statistic. So you mentioned that some applications would get rejected at the start because they don't have enough information, or they get granted with conditions. How many applications get withdrawn?
Well, that number is high.
Yeah. And that kind of is reflected in the number. So applicants know when the applications are checking on decline, where the effects are checking into more than minor, and it's going to check into notification, limited or public notification. And that's kind of where their proposals change. They withdraw the applications or
put it on hold.
Put it on hold. So we've got quite a few in system that are on hold or have been withdrawn
For that reason.
for exactly those reasons, because and then that's kind of where complaints coming from developers, because we do track towards that direction. So
So there's a lot of communication that happens between the council and applicants, aside from trying to negotiate the conditions that we would be willing to grant a consent for. There are quite a few cases where, when we've gone through the notification process and we are just about at that decision-making stage in the process, where if we feel like this is just too contrary to what we can consent, that's when the discussions happen. Yeah. So I would probably say, rough estimate, but probably about 10%. 10%, yeah.
Okay. So when applications are withdrawn, do we have good information of that person's experience with the process and why they've withdrawn it?
How do you mean in terms of?
I guess something like, yeah, some sort of feedback. So do we know why people are withdrawing out of the process, or are we guessing? One of the criticisms of the process from industry that I hear is when it gets too hard, when their view council makes it too hard, but when the process becomes too cumbersome, they just withdraw it. So do we have a follow-up process to understand what's going in there? Have we got a whole lot of developers that are going away just because it's getting too hard here?
Interesting question. I would say, yeah, it's a bit of a catch-22. So possibly we could circle back when we issue them the withdrawal letter. So withdrawing application does go through a formal process where they submit to us, we confirm in writing, and we issue a withdrawal letter just confirming that the application has been withdrawn. Generally, when applications are withdrawn, it's because either the effects are more than minor, so they do trigger notifications, and applicants don't want to go down the pathway of public notification. But from a planning framework, it's quite defined why we would trigger, and they may not agree to that. And generally, our backing is always sound. Some of the instances where applications go on hold is that they provide us information as part of their package, and when we consult with our technical experts and our infrastructure team, then part of the RFI requires them to do landscape visual assessments to assess the effect on the surroundings. Flood modeling is quite common, and with capacity and the amount of ponding we have, we do require modeling. And unfortunately, with the consultants in that space, it takes sometimes 4 months and to get a hydrologist to get to your site, as well as it being really costly because you're not just assessing the effect of modeling on your site, but also modeling on the catchment, which is quite costly. And when developers sum up the extent of, I just want to create a few lots, I don't want to do modeling, landscape, visual assessments, which is informed by the plan. So it's kind of plan requirements and infrastructure requirements. Then they decide to withdraw the application. So yeah, it's catch-22 because it's not us trying to work against the applicants. It's kind of, them providing information for us to be able to assess the effect.
I'll add to that as well. The other thing is in terms of getting approval. So sometimes applicants also do not want to get approval from external parties. So it could be that we deem Greater Wellington to be an affected party on some of our applications, which means that they then have to, the focus sort of moves to Greater Wellington then, and there could be quite a significant process associated with that. So then the process just becomes too hard. Another one that I know of that we've had in the past is where we require them to seek approval from iwi, and they would just, sometimes it's blanketly refusing to talk to iwi, and because we deem them as affected parties, then they just withdraw the application or they put it on hold. And under the RMA, there's very limited ability for us to move anything off on hold. Once it's put on hold, essentially it can be on hold for years. We've got some applications that dates back to 2016 still in the system just because it's on hold, and there's no ability to change that unless they withdraw.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, final question, Jocelyn?
Yeah, so it's not really, well, I suppose it is a question. I'm just trying to find the final version of the plan change 2 on our website, and I can't seem to find it. Is it there?
Plan change 2 would have been incorporated in the current district plan, so
It's about, okay, so it will be included there somewhere, all the words and everything?
Yeah.
Okay, because like I know when you go onto the website, it actually specifies all these other little plan changes, but not specifically plan change 2. It talks about the
They'll be the ones underway.
preliminary
presumably?
ones.
If you click on the tab district planning and then go view full, it'll give you the full district plan with plan change to incorporated into it.
Great.
yeah.
Okay.
We'll get you some help with that if you need it later, Jocelyn.
Yes, thank you.
Definitely.
Well, I know, but it's got operative plan changes, 1A, 1B, 1C, and it's got plan change 2. Then it doesn't specifically.
Yeah, we'll sort this out later, Jocelyn,
Yes,
because
but-
we want to wrap up this briefing.
So, but
That's
there's
okay.
one other little question or comment that I wanted to make about in terms of upskilling people. You know, you mentioned that there were these 32 rules. I don't know whether they're actually quite clearly laid out in the document, and so that can give some, I suppose, some background for what people need to consider or actually need to be looking at when they are asking questions of us, and for us to know, you know, what sort of issues that they are potentially having to deal with. And then the other one was about the definitions of more than minor, and I know that's tricky.
I think that's a key thing that we need to flesh out a bit more. That's the kind of key to it, this more than minor that triggers or doesn't trigger notification. That's kind of a bit the crux of it, really.
Yep. And understanding how you get to it.
Now, Martin, is your hand just still up from before?
No, just one quick follow-up question in regards to a question that was just asked.
Sure, go.
Yep, it's just in relation to the comments around having Greater Wellington or EV as affected parties, and some of the stuff either having been on hold or just been able to be dealt with. At what point does it become obstructive, or at what point does it become a situation where maybe EV aren't engaging? I don't know, for whatever reason. Same with Greater Wellington. Is there a point where it becomes, I don't know, needs to be taken past that point as such? What's the process for that?
Yes, that's what it is.
To
It
notify.
becomes a notified application. So if they do not provide the information, which in this case would be the written approval by those parties, then it becomes a notified application.
Okay, cool. All right, thank you.
If I can add to the GDAB stuff, generally applications that are submitted to council for assessment, there's specific triggers that would trigger Greater Wellington's comment or applications to GDAB. So as part of our network in Kapiti, for example, we have our flood extents. Our flood extents are not our own. They also include GDAB flood extents for rivers and catchments that are managed by Greater Wellington. So generally, as part of our applications that we receive, we do steer applicants down if their properties are within the GDAB flood extents, purely for comments from the flood protection team, where, for example, they are doing earthworks that are more than 3,000 cubes or in close proximity to GDAB rivers, streams under their jurisdiction, then as part of their land use consent from us, they would also require consents from GDAB as part of their applications.
All right, lovely, thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for answering those questions. Lots of them today. We went on a little bit longer than we expected, but it's really worth digging into this issue, and look forward to more information by way of FAQs and a little bit more about what constitutes more than minor and those 32 rules that Jocelyn was mentioning. I think they're the three things that we're kind of a bit more follow-up on initially. That's okay? Brilliant. Okay. I hope everybody's found that useful today. Really good stuff. Thank you.